Okay, yeah, so this is the title of my talk, and this is work in collaboration with my advisor, Ellen Markman, in psychology. So about a year ago, there was a computer science program for girls at the White House. This is Joe Biden with one of those students, and at this particular moment, he's sitting at a big oval table with a lot of these students, and he looks around at them and he says, you guys do understand, by the way, you're as smart as any boy in the world. You know that, right? There's not a single solitary thing a man can do that you can't do. Just remember that. And a lot of people in the media actually reacted very negatively to this. So here are just some reactions from Twitter that I thought were nice. So Biden is so dim, he needs to stop talking. People were very upset by these comments that Joe had to say. And so an interesting question is, why did people react so negatively? And so one idea is that the way that we frame comparisons matters. This is research that dates back to the 1970s and Amos Tversky and colleagues, where they gave adult participants sentences like this: horses are similar to zebras, or zebras are similar to horses, and they were just asked to identify which sentence that they would prefer to say, which one sounds better. And what he found was that adults overwhelmingly preferred to say zebras are similar to horses. Now, why would this be? If horses are similar to zebras, and zebras should also be similar to horses, so why does one sound better than the other? Well, one proposal is that in comparisons like these, which I'll call directional comparisons, we prefer what I'm going to call variance to reference points, where reference points are more prototypical, common, well-known concepts. Variants are less prototypical, less common. And so we prefer to say that zebras are similar to horses because we typically think of horses as the more common, prototypical animal. And when you reverse the comparison and now you frame zebras as the reference point, it doesn't sound as good because we don't typically think of zebras as the more typical animal with respect to horses. So an important prediction that follows from this theory is that if I give you a sentence or a comparison with two made-up words that you know nothing about, you might nevertheless make certain inferences about them just based on their positions in the sentence. So in other words, because the GAX is framed as the reference point, you might infer that the GAX is more important, more famous, older, bigger, and less mobile than the Zim. And this was a study that Lila Gleitman and colleagues did in 1996. So to take it back to Joe Biden's quote and our discussions of gender and gender similarities, comparing girls to boys, so he said something like, you girls are as smart as any boy in the world, can actually implicitly and subtly suggest that boys, because they're framed as the reference point, are more important, more famous, and maybe even typically smarter than girls are. And so this could be one of the things that people really didn't like about what he was saying. So the first question that we wanted to ask was whether adults do tend to frame comparisons in particular ways in everyday conversation. So is this just Joe Biden or something that everybody tends to do? So what we did was we looked at Twitter, a really nice source of a lot of naturalistic language data, and we searched for the terms women are as blank as men and men are as blank as women, where the asterisk could be replaced with any adjective. And we were interested in how frequent these comparisons are. So do we tend to compare women to men more than men to women? And also the valence of the comparison. So do we tend to say things like women are as great as men, or men are as terrible as women, or something like that? So I'll show you the results for this analysis of Twitter data, data taken over the course of 1 year. So when we looked at comparisons comparing women to men, we found that in 1 year there were 711, that should be moved down, but 711 tweets. And I'll show you what the valence was like. So on the x-axis, negative 100 refers to really negative things like terrible. 100 refers to really positive things like brilliant. And on the y-axis, we just have the number of tweets. And so you can see that when we compared women to men, there were a lot of negative things. So women are as bad as men, as violent as men, but also a lot of positive comparisons too. So women are as great as men, as smart as men, as capable as men, okay? But when you look at comparisons comparing men to women, it's pretty different. So first of all, there are almost half as many tweets here. So people are comparing women to men way more often than they're comparing men to women. And when you look at the valence of the comparisons, the distribution is also really different. So you're saying men are as weak as women, as gullible as women, as bad as women, and you're never saying anything positive. You're never saying men are as smart as women. So what does this tell us? It tells us, that the way that we frame comparisons in everyday conversation is not arbitrary. We tend to compare women to men more often because we think of men as the typical higher status gender. And furthermore, we think of men as the typical gender for positive traits and women basically as the typical gender for negative traits, unfortunately. So the next question we wanted to ask was, could these directional comparisons, in addition to reflecting our stereotypic beliefs about gender, also teach them in a way? And specifically, we were interested in the stereotype that boys are not only typically smarter than girls, but naturally smarter than girls. And we were interested in this particular implication because there exists a stereotype that boys are the naturally smarter gender, and natural brilliance and raw talent are valued in certain fields like physics and philosophy and math. So it seems to be a real obstacle, this stereotype preventing women from succeeding in these fields. So we wanted to know whether these attempts to express gender equality could also kind of unintentionally, implicitly perpetuate this really harmful, damaging stereotype. So what we did was we had adults read a series of 8 directional comparisons about made-up traits, and we used made-up traits so that we could isolate the effect of the word order itself. So adults weren't reading these with any bias about what freakishness is. So they read a series of 8 comparisons like this. Half the time boys were compared to girls, half the time girls were compared to boys, and they were asked one of 2 questions afterwards. So one trial might look like this. Sorry, this is a little small. Suppose someone tells you that boys are as thwomous as girls. Who would you think has to work harder to be thwomous? Here we predict that adults should say boys, because boys are framed as the variant in this case. Another trial might look like, suppose someone tells you that girls are as ploppant as boys. In this case, who would you think is naturally more ploppant? Here we predict that adults should also say boys, because now boys are framed as the reference point. Another group of adults read 8 non-directional comparisons. So non-directional comparisons put both genders in the subject position of the sentence. And so here we predict that they should not be biased to think of one gender as being naturally more talented than the other. And so again, 2 trials might be like, suppose someone tells you that boys and girls are as yesn't as each other. Who would you think is naturally more yesent? You predict that adults should be at chance here. Suppose someone tells you that girls and boys are as guilting as each other. Who would you think has to work harder to be guilting? Again, adults should be at chance, because word order in the subject position alone should not matter. So I'll show you our results. So just to walk you through this, on the x-axis, we're going to see the different comparisons that our participants saw. So starting with comparing girls to boys. On the y-axis is the proportion of responses that chose each gender. And first I'll show you the responses to the question about natural ability, or having the trait inherently. So when adults read comparisons comparing girls to boys, and they were asked who has this trait naturally, adults overwhelmingly said boys. So we have boys in the darker color here. When adults read comparisons comparing boys to girls, they made the exact opposite inference. So now they're saying that girls are the ones who naturally have this trait. And when you look at the 2 non-directional comparisons, adults are perfectly at chance. So it really seems to be the word order, the syntax of these comparisons that's driving these inferences. And I'll show you the results for our question about effort. So who has to work harder to be freakish? Again, on the x-axis we have our comparisons, on the y-axis we have the proportion choosing each gender. And you can see that now when you're asked about effort, and you see a comparison comparing girls to boys, you're saying, oh yeah, girls have to work harder to have that trait. And again, when you see boys compared to girls, now boys have to work harder to have that trait, because now boys are framed as the variant. And again, with the non-directional comparisons, adults were pretty perfectly at chance. And so just to show you these next to each other, adults are clearly making opposite inferences in response to each question. And also what's worth noting is that the strength of the inference, so how often you say boys when you read a comparison comparing girls to boys, is equally as strong when you see a comparison comparing boys to girls. So it doesn't matter which gender is where, the strength of your inference about natural ability and effort is the same. So to conclude, directional comparisons such as girls are as smart as boys, they literally explicitly express similarity between girls and boys, but as I've discussed, these comparisons might also implicitly suggest gender differences. So they might suggest that boys are just generally the typical higher status gender, and as I've shown with my research, they might also suggest that boys are the ones, in this case, who are naturally intelligent, while girls have to work really hard to be equally intelligent. So if we take it back to Joe Biden, you guys do understand, by the way, you're as smart as any boy in the world. Maybe to, receive a little less backlash, he could have said something like, girls and boys are equally smart. Although, the implications of saying this at all is a whole other topic of investigation worth doing. So thank you to my collaborators, my advisor, Ellen Markman, and thank you for listening.